I can still hear the wind in those woods, whistling like a mournful cry, even now. It's been years, but when I close my eyes, I'm back there, sitting by the fire, surrounded by shadows that danced and leaped like spirits. I'll tell you what happened, but I warn you, once you hear this, you might never look at a forest the same way again. It started innocently enough. Four of us, me, my boyfriend Todd, and our friends Jenny and Mark, decided to spend a weekend camping deep in the woods near Black Hollow. It was one of those places you only hear about in whispers. People claimed the land was cursed, that strange things happened there. But we were young, stupid, and craving an adventure. The first day was perfect. We hiked, set up camp, and roasted marshmallows over a crackling fire. The woods were alive with the sound of crickets and owls, and the air was cool, crisp, and clean. It felt like the kind of escape we all needed. That night, though, things began to change. It started subtly, branches snapping in the distance, though there was no wind. Mark joked it was a bear, but I could see the nervous flicker in his eyes. Then Jenny said she saw something moving between the trees, something big and fast. We laughed it off, teasing her about being scared of shadows, but her face turned pale. "I'm serious," she whispered. "It wasn't a person. It was taller." Todd rolled his eyes, trying to lighten the mood. "Relax, Jenny. It's probably just your imagination." But deep down, I felt it too. A shift in the air, a weight pressing down like the forest itself was watching us. Around midnight, we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling our campsite. Slow, deliberate, heavy. "Who's out there?" Todd called out, standing and shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no animals. Just endless black. "Probably a raccoon," Mark muttered, though his voice was shaky. But I knew raccoons didn't walk like that. We tried to laugh it off and crawled into our tents, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle, every creak, every gust of wind felt like a warning. I clung to Todd, listening to his steady breathing, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Then came the scream. It was high-pitched, inhuman, and so loud it seemed to vibrate the air. We all shot up, hearts pounding. Todd unzipped the tent and stepped out, clutching the flashlight. Jenny and Mark were already outside, huddled together, pale as ghosts. "What the hell was that?" Jenny stammered. Todd scanned the area, his flashlight beam shaking. "I don't know. Maybe a fox or a bobcat." "That wasn't an animal," Mark said, his voice low and trembling. "It sounded like a woman." And then we saw it. Between the trees, barely visible, was a figure. At first, it looked like a person, tall and thin, draped in what I thought was tattered clothing. But as the light hit it, my stomach dropped. Its skin was ashen, its limbs too long, and its head cocked at an unnatural angle. The face was the worst, a hollow, gaping maw where a mouth should have been, and empty, black voids where eyes should have glowed. We froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The thing didn't come closer. It just stood there, swaying slightly, as though it were deciding what to do with us. "Run," Todd whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing only our phones and a single flashlight, we bolted into the woods, leaving everything else behind. Branches clawed at our faces and legs, the ground uneven and treacherous. But we didn't stop. We didn't dare look back. The footsteps followed. At first, they were distant, but then they grew louder, faster, as though whatever was chasing us was gaining speed. And it wasn't alone. More screams echoed through the trees, each one more horrifying than the last. I glanced over my shoulder and wished I hadn't. Dozens of figures were emerging from the shadows, each more grotesque than the first, twisted, skeletal bodies, eyes glowing like embers, faces frozen in eternal screams. "Keep going," Todd yelled, pulling me forward. Jenny tripped and fell, crying out in pain. Mark stopped to help her, but I saw the look in his eyes. He was terrified. "We're not going to make it," Jenny sobbed. "Yes, we will," Todd shouted. "Just keep moving." But I knew he didn't believe it. None of us did. The figures were closing in, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes on tangled strings. And then, one by one, they began to whisper. It wasn't a language I understood, but the sound crawled under my skin, filling my head with static and dread. The whispers turned to wails, and the wails became laughter, mocking, cruel, echoing all around us. We burst into a clearing, gasping for breath. There was no time to rest, no time to think. The figures were right behind us, their gnarled hands reaching out, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "Over there!" Todd pointed to an old, decrepit cabin in the distance. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, the roof caving in, the windows shattered. But it was our only chance. We sprinted to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind us. The air inside was thick with mildew and rot, but at least it was a barrier between us and them. Or so we thought. The whispers returned, louder now, vibrating through the walls. The door rattled as though something, or many things, were clawing at it, desperate to get inside. Jenny was sobbing uncontrollably, Mark pacing and muttering to himself. Todd and I tried to barricade the door with broken furniture, but it felt futile. Then the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against our ears like a physical force. I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, they were gone. And then the door exploded inward. They poured in like a flood, their twisted bodies filling the room. The whispers turned to screams, and the screams turned to a deafening roar. I don't remember much after that, just flashes. Todd being dragged away, his face contorted in terror. Jenny's screams cutting off abruptly, Mark's hands slipping from mine as something pulled him into the shadows. I ran. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. I don't remember finding the road or collapsing into the arms of the search party. They told me I was lucky to be alive, that I must have gotten lost and imagined everything. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And when I close my eyes, I can still feel them watching me, waiting for the day I return to the woods. Because they never let you leave. Not really.
Story number 2.
It's been 3 years, but every time I close my eyes, I'm back in those woods, sitting by that campfire. I can still feel the chill of the night air and hear the crackle of the flames. But more than that, I can hear the whispers. It was supposed to be a weekend to unwind. Just me, my older brother Kyle, and his best friend Jake. We all needed an escape, so Kyle suggested we camp out in Devil's Hollow. I should have known better. Everyone in town had a story about that place. About the strange disappearances, the shadows that moved without light, and the noises that didn't belong. But we laughed it off. We were too old for ghost stories, right? The first night was uneventful. We hiked deep into the forest, set up camp near a clearing, and lit a fire. The woods were silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves. The silence was unnerving, but Jake cracked jokes, and Kyle told embarrassing stories about me to keep the mood light. Then, just after midnight, everything changed. It started with the wind, or rather, the lack of it. The air was still, heavy, and suffocating. The fire, which had been roaring minutes ago, suddenly dimmed to a weak flicker. We all noticed it at the same time, exchanging uneasy glances. "You feel that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. The air felt electric, like the calm before a storm. Kyle tried to shake it off. "It's just the woods. They can mess with your head at night." But then we heard it. A low, guttural hum coming from deep within the trees. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was wrong. "Probably just the wind," Kyle said again, though his voice betrayed him. "No way," Jake muttered. "Wind doesn't sound like that." The hum grew louder, more insistent, and then it stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. We sat there, straining our ears, waiting for something, anything to happen. That's when I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the firelight. At first I thought it was a person, but the way it moved wasn't human. It was tall and spindly, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It swayed slightly as though the wind, if there had been any, was pushing it. "Kyle," I whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "Do you see that?" He followed my gaze and his face went pale. "Jake, get the flashlight." Jake fumbled for it, his hands shaking. When he turned it on and pointed it at the figure, it was gone. "What the hell?" Jake said, spinning around. But the woods were empty, or so we thought. We tried to laugh it off, but no one could shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Kyle suggested we turn in for the night, so we crawled into our tents, but none of us could sleep. Every creak, every rustle, every snap of a twig outside made my heart race. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was Kyle and Jake talking, but the voices weren't theirs. They were soft and melodic, like a song sung in a language I couldn't understand. I unzipped my tent and peeked out. The fire was out and the clearing was bathed in moonlight. Kyle and Jake were both still in their tents, motionless. But just beyond the clearing, in the trees, I saw them. Dozens of figures, pale and translucent, swaying in unison. Their mouths moved, but their faces were blank, featureless. The whispers grew louder, filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. One of the figures turned toward me, its head tilting slowly, and even without eyes, I knew it was looking right at me. Then, it stepped forward. The moment its foot touched the clearing, the whispers stopped. replaced by an ear-splitting shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Kyle and Jake burst out of their tents, disoriented and terrified. "What's happening?" Kyle shouted. Before I could answer, the figure lunged. We ran, crashing through the forest, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. The shrieks followed us, mingling with the sound of our panicked breathing and pounding footsteps. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually we stumbled into a ravine. Jake slipped, falling hard, and twisted his ankle. He screamed in pain, and Kyle and I skidded to a stop. "We can't leave him," I cried. Kyle hesitated, then nodded. "Help me carry him." We each took one of Jake's arms and started dragging him, but the figures were closing in. I could see them now, their bodies illuminated by the faint moonlight. They were no longer featureless. Their faces were grotesque, twisted masks of agony. Their mouths stretched wide in eternal screams. One of them reached out, its long, bony fingers inches from Jake's leg. "Go!" Jake yelled. "Leave me!" "Not a chance!" Kyle growled, pulling him harder. Then the whispers returned, louder than before, pounding in my skull. My vision blurred and I stumbled, nearly dropping Jake. "We're not gonna make it," I sobbed. "Yes, we are," Kyle shouted, but even he didn't sound convinced. Just when I thought it was over, we saw it, a cabin hidden among the trees. It was old and decrepit, but it was something. Without a word, we stumbled toward it, throwing the door open and collapsing inside. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door slammed shut on its own and the room plunged into darkness. "What the hell is going on?" Jake whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Kyle said, his breath ragged. The cabin felt wrong. The air was thick and stale, and the walls seemed to pulse, as though the building itself were alive. Then, the whispers started again, inside the cabin this time. The shadows in the corners began to move, stretching and writhing like living things. One by one, they took shape, forming into the figures from the woods. They didn't lunge this time. They just stood there, swaying and whispering, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "Stay back," Kyle shouted, brandishing a broken chair leg. But they didn't move. They didn't have to. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with static and dread. I dropped to my knees, clutching my ears, but it didn't help. The last thing I remember is Kyle screaming, Jake's voice begging for help, and the sound of the cabin collapsing around us. I woke up at sunrise, lying in the middle of the clearing. The tents were gone. The fire pit was cold. Kyle and Jake were nowhere to be found. I searched for hours, screaming their names, but there was no sign of them. Eventually, I found my way back to the trailhead and flagged down a ranger. They never found Kyle or Jake. The official report said they must have gotten lost, but I know the truth. The woods took them, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispers calling my name.
Story number 3.
The first thing I noticed about the campsite was how quiet it was. Too quiet. It wasn't the kind of peace you'd expect deep in the woods. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, making you hyper-aware of every little sound. I should have trusted my gut and turned back then, but I didn't. It was my girlfriend, Lisa's idea to go camping. She'd been stressed from work, and a weekend in nature sounded perfect. Disconnect from the world, reconnect with each other, she said. It was a nice sentiment, but the moment we set foot in Black Hollow, I regretted it. The place had a reputation. People talked about it in hushed tones, calling it cursed or haunted. Stories of hikers disappearing, campers leaving in the middle of the night, too scared to explain why. But Lisa didn't believe in that kind of thing, and I didn't want to seem like a coward. By the time we set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The trees cast long, skeletal shadows across the clearing, and the air grew colder, sharper. Lisa was in high spirits, teasing me for my obvious unease. "Don't tell me you believe those stupid ghost stories," she said, laughing as she lit the campfire. I forced a grin. "Of course not. It's just creepy, you know?" The fire crackled to life, and for a while it felt like everything was okay. We roasted marshmallows, told dumb jokes, and tried to ignore the oppressive darkness surrounding us. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It started with the noises, faint at first, like twigs snapping or leaves rustling. I brushed it off as animals, but then I realized the sounds were coming from all around us. Lisa heard it too. She paused mid-sentence, her eyes darting to the shadows. "Probably just deer," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I nodded, trying to convince myself she was right. But then came the laughter. It was faint, like it was carried on the wind, but unmistakable. A child's laugh, high-pitched and eerie, echoing through the trees. Lisa froze, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I whispered, my throat dry. "Kids? Maybe?" she said, though we both knew there shouldn't be anyone else out here. The laughter came again, closer this time. And then another sound, a faint whisper, just at the edge of hearing. I stood, holding the flashlight tight in my hand. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The laughter stopped. For a moment, the silence was so heavy it felt like the world had stopped. Then there was movement in the trees. "Maybe we should pack up," Lisa said, her voice trembling. I nodded, my instincts screaming that we needed to leave. But as we started gathering our things, the fire suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness. Lisa screamed, and I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking. When I finally turned it on, the beam cut through the blackness, landing on something I'll never forget. A figure stood just beyond the trees, pale and motionless. It was tall and thin, its arms too long, its face shrouded in shadow. But its eyes, those hollow black voids, burned into me. Lisa grabbed my arm. "Run!" We took off into the woods, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The laughter started again, louder now, mixed with whispers and the sound of footsteps behind us. I dared to look back, and my heart nearly stopped. The figure was following us, gliding through the trees like it didn't need to move its legs. And behind it, more figures emerged, their shapes shifting and unnatural. "We're not going to make it," Lisa cried, tears streaming down her face. "Just keep running," I shouted, though I didn't know where we were going. The woods seemed endless, the trees closing in around us. Every direction looked the same, and the sounds grew louder, more menacing. Then we saw it, a faint light in the distance. "There!" I yelled, pulling Lisa toward it. As we got closer, the light revealed a small cabin, its windows glowing with a dim, flickering light. We didn't hesitate. We burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us. Inside, the cabin was eerily quiet. Dust covered every surface, and the air was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. But there was a single lantern on the table, its flame steady and unnatural. Lisa collapsed into a chair, sobbing. "What was that? What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, trying to catch my breath. "But we're safe now." I shouldn't have said that. The whispers started again, low and insistent, coming from the walls. The lantern flickered, casting strange shadows that didn't match our movements. "We need to leave," Lisa said, her voice barely audible. "Go where?" I said, panic rising in my chest. "It's out there." Before she could respond, the door creaked open. We both froze, staring as the door swung wide, revealing the darkness beyond. The figures were there, standing just outside, their bodies twisting and contorting unnaturally. One of them stepped inside. Its head lolled to the side, and its mouth opened in a soundless scream. I grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her toward the back of the cabin, but there was nowhere to go. The whispers grew deafening, filling my head, making it impossible to think. Lisa screamed, and I turned to see one of the figures reach for her. "No!" I shouted, grabbing a broken piece of wood from the floor and swinging it wildly. The figure recoiled, its form dissolving into smoke, but more of them poured into the cabin, their hollow eyes fixed on us. Lisa clung to me, her nails digging into my arm. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The lantern on the table flared suddenly, its light blazing so brightly it hurt to look at. The figures shrieked, their forms writhing in the light, and then they vanished, leaving us alone in the silence. For a moment, neither of us moved, too scared to believe it was over. Then the lantern went out, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the last thing I remember is Lisa's scream as the floor beneath us gave way. I woke up alone, lying in the middle of the clearing where we'd set up camp. The fire pit was cold, our tent was gone, and Lisa wasn't there. I searched the woods for hours, screaming her name, but I never found her. When I made it back to town, no one believed me. They said I must have gotten lost, that Lisa probably wandered off and got turned around. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I can still hear the laughter.
Story number 4.
It wasn't my idea to go camping that weekend. I've never liked the woods, especially not at night. But my friends, Jake and Mia, insisted. "Come on, Kevin," they said. "We'll build a fire, make s'mores, and tell scary stories. It'll be fun." I should have trusted my instincts and stayed home. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any other campers. Jake said the isolation made it authentic. Authentic was right. It felt like we'd stumbled into another world entirely, one that didn't want us there. The sun had barely set when the atmosphere shifted. The forest grew colder, the air heavy. Even the usual sounds of wildlife, crickets, owls, rustling leaves, faded into an oppressive silence. Jake tried to lighten the mood. "All right, let's get this fire going," he said, striking a match and tossing it into the pile of wood. The flames sprang to life, casting long shadows that danced against the trees. We sat around the fire, laughing and joking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see, I don't know what, something. "You're jumpy tonight," Mia said, nudging me. "I don't know," I replied. "Doesn't this place feel off to you?" She shrugged. "It's just the woods. You're overthinking it." Jake smirked. "Maybe we need to tell some ghost stories to get you in the mood." He launched into some tale about a haunted cabin, complete with exaggerated voices and dramatic pauses. Mia rolled her eyes, but I couldn't focus. My attention was drawn to the darkness beyond the firelight. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the fire. But then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, stepping closer before vanishing behind a tree. "Did you see that?" I whispered, cutting Jake off mid-story. "See what?" he asked, frowning. "There's someone out there." Mia looked around, squinting into the shadows. "I don't see anything." I swear, there was. A branch snapped, loud and sharp like a gunshot. We all froze. Jake grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the woods. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and underbrush, swaying slightly in the breeze. "It's probably just an animal," he said, but his voice wavered. We sat back down, but the mood had shifted. The fire seemed dimmer, the shadows longer. Mia tried to break the tension. "Okay, my turn for a story," she said. "Have you guys heard about the Hollow Woods Witch?" Jake groaned. "Oh, come on. Not that old story." "It's perfect for tonight," she said, grinning. According to Mia, the Hollow Woods Witch was a local legend. A woman accused of witchcraft in the 1800s had been dragged into the forest by the townsfolk and executed. They burned her alive, right where we were camping. "They say her spirit still wanders these woods," Mia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Looking for anyone foolish enough to spend the night here. If you hear her whispers, it's already too late." Jake rolled his eyes. "Nice try, Mia. That's just a story." Another branch snapped, closer this time. We all jumped, and Jake grabbed the flashlight again, his bravado slipping. He shone the light into the trees, sweeping it back and forth. Nothing. "All right, that's it," Jake said, standing. "Whoever's out there, you need to leave. We're not messing around." The only response was silence. Jake sighed and turned back to us. "See, just your imagination." "Kev," a low, raspy whisper interrupted him. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. Mia grabbed my arm. "What was that?" Jake's face went pale. "Probably just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The whisper came again, louder this time, circling us like it was carried on the wind. The fire flickered, its flames shrinking as the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath now, each exhale a cloud of mist. Then we saw her. She stepped into the firelight, her movements slow and jerky like a puppet on strings. Her hair was long and matted, her skin pale and cracked, like porcelain. But her eyes, those black, empty voids, were what froze me in place. Mia screamed, and Jake dropped the flashlight. It hit the ground and rolled, casting erratic beams of light that only made the scene more terrifying. The woman raised a hand, pointing at us with fingers that ended in sharp, blackened claws. Her mouth moved, but the whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Run!" I managed to choke out, grabbing Mia's hand. We bolted into the woods, Jake close behind. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches clawing at our clothes and skin. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent. "This way!" Jake shouted, veering to the left. I followed, my legs burning, my chest heaving. Mia stumbled, and I caught her, pulling her upright. "Keep going!" I yelled. We broke into a clearing, the moonlight casting a faint glow over the grass. For a moment, I thought we'd lost her. Then the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. We stood there, gasping for air, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Jake pointed. "There, a cabin!" Sure enough, a small, dilapidated cabin stood at the edge of the clearing. Its windows were dark, its door hanging crookedly on its hinges. "Are you insane?" Mia said. "We can't go in there." "Do you want to stay out here?" Jake shot back. He had a point. We ran to the cabin, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind us. The inside was as bad as the outside. Dusty, broken furniture, and a strange smell that made my stomach turn. Jake barricaded the door with an old chair while Mia and I huddled in the corner. "Do you think she'll come in here?" Mia whispered. "I don't know," I said honestly. The whispers started again, faint at first, then louder, filling the cabin like a chorus of voices. The temperature dropped even further, frost forming on the windows. "She's here," Jake said, his voice trembling. The door rattled, the chair creaking under the pressure. Then it stopped. We held our breath, waiting. The whispers grew quieter, fading into silence. Jake moved toward the door, peeking through a crack. "I think she's..." The door exploded inward, sending Jake flying. The woman stood in the doorway, her eyes fixed on us. She stepped inside, the whispers growing deafening. I grabbed a piece of broken wood and swung it at her, but she didn't even flinch. Her gaze shifted to me, and I felt a cold, crushing weight settle over my chest. Mia screamed, and the woman turned to her, raising a clawed hand. "No!" I shouted, throwing the wood at her. It struck her shoulder, and for a moment she flickered like an image on a screen. Jake scrambled to his feet. "The fire! Maybe she hates fire!" There was a rusty lantern on the table. Jake grabbed it, fumbling with the matches. The woman turned to him, her whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. Come on," Jake muttered, striking a match. The flame caught, and he swung the lantern at her. The moment the fire touched her, she let out an ear-piercing shriek. Her form flickered again, then dissolved into smoke. The whispers stopped. We didn't wait to see if she'd come back. We ran until we found the road, collapsing in exhaustion when we finally reached our car. None of us spoke on the drive home. To this day, I don't know what we saw in those woods, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window.
Story number 5.
I've always been drawn to the woods. There's something about the stillness, the way the trees seem to strenuously toward the sky, that feels both comforting and isolating. But after that night, I don't think I'll ever set foot in the forest again. It started with a simple plan. My friend Liz suggested we take a weekend camping trip to disconnect from the stress of work and life. "It'll be good for us," she said. "No phones, no emails, just nature." We convinced a few others to join us. Eric, the outdoorsy one, and Hannah, who was hesitant but eventually gave in to Liz's enthusiasm. We drove out to a remote spot Liz had found online. It was miles away from civilization, surrounded by dense trees and untouched wilderness. Perfect, or so we thought. The first day was uneventful. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows while Eric told ridiculous ghost stories. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen, and for a moment, I understood why people romanticize the outdoors. It was the second night when things started to feel wrong. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Liz was trying to convince us to play some card games she'd brought, but Hannah kept glancing over her shoulder. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked suddenly. We paused, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing but the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from deeper in the woods, too steady to be an animal. Eric shrugged. "Probably just a woodpecker." At night, Hannah shot back, her voice tinged with unease. "Relax," Liz said. "It's probably nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. The tapping continued, growing louder and closer. It stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. "Let's just go to bed," I suggested, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. The others agreed, and we retreated to our tents. I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside seemed amplified. The rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. My heart jumped at every noise, my mind conjuring images of predators or strangers lurking just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. Then I heard it again. The tapping. It was closer now, right outside the camp. I held my breath, listening as it moved from one tent to another, circling us. My hand tightened around the flashlight beside me, but I was too scared to turn it on. A low whisper joined the tapping, indistinct and eerie, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I clenched my eyes shut, willing it to stop. Eventually, it did. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. In the morning, I expected the others to laugh off the noises as my imagination, but the tension around the campfire told me I wasn't alone. "Did anyone else hear something last night?" Hannah asked hesitantly. Liz frowned. "I thought I heard tapping, like footsteps maybe?" Eric nodded. "Same, I got up to check, but I didn't see anything." I glanced at him sharply. "You went outside?" "Yeah," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "There was nothing there, probably just the wind." None of us believed that, but we didn't want to admit it. We spent the day hiking, trying to shake the unease. But no matter how far we went, It felt like we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The beautiful sight did little to lift our spirits. The fire crackled as we sat around it, eating in silence. Then Liz spoke. "Do you guys see that?" She was staring into the woods, her face pale. We followed her gaze. At first, I saw nothing. Then a shape emerged, a figure standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its head cocked to one side as if observing us. I couldn't make out any features, but its outline was unmistakable. "Is that a person?" Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Eric said, standing slowly. "Stay here." He grabbed a stick from the fire, holding it like a torch, and stepped toward the figure. "Hey, who's there?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. "Eric, stop!" Liz hissed, but he ignored her. He reached the edge of the clearing and thrust the makeshift torch toward the figure. The flames illuminated. The figure was gone. Eric stumbled back, his face pale. "I swear it was right here," he said, looking around frantically. We didn't sleep that night. The fire blazed as we sat in a tight circle, jumping at every noise. The tapping returned, circling the camp. This time it was accompanied by laughter, soft and high-pitched like a child's giggle. It echoed in the darkness, coming from all around us. Liz started crying. "We need to leave," she said. "Right now." Eric shook his head. "It's too dangerous to hike out in the dark. We'll wait for morning." Morning felt impossibly far away. The laughter grew louder, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to move on their own. At one point, I thought I saw hands, long, skeletal hands, reaching out from the darkness, but when I blinked, they were gone. Then the fire went out. We scrambled to relight it, but the matches wouldn't catch. The darkness was suffocating, the laughter deafening. Something brushed against my leg, and I screamed, flailing wildly. "Run!" Eric shouted, grabbing Liz's arm. We bolted, leaving our tents and supplies behind. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at us as we ran. The laughter followed us, growing louder and more maniacal. I don't know how long we ran before we stumbled onto a dirt road. A passing car stopped, and the driver, a kind-looking older man, took one look at us and asked no questions. He drove us back to town, where we called the authorities. When we returned with the rangers the next day, our campsite was untouched. The fire pit was cold, our tent still standing. There was no sign of anything unusual, no footprints, no broken branches. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. Liz refuses to talk about it. Eric insists it was just a trick of the light, a group hallucination. Hannah moved to the city and hasn't stepped foot in the woods since. As for me, I still hear the laughter sometimes, faint and distant, like it's calling me back.
Story number 6.
There's a saying around here, don't go into the woods after dark. It's not some quaint old wives' tale or a warning about wild animals. It's a rule I foolishly broke one summer night. I grew up in a small town nestled against an endless expanse of forest. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and nothing ever seemed to happen. I used to think the warnings about the woods were just another way to keep kids from wandering too far. But the older I got, the more I noticed how seriously people took it. Even the most skeptical adults wouldn't dare venture into those trees once the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a dare that did me in. My friends and I had been sitting around a campfire at the edge of the woods, bored and itching for excitement. Tommy, the self-proclaimed tough guy of the group, smirked at me across the flames. "Bet you won't last an hour in there," he said, jerking his thumb toward the looming tree line. "Why wouldn't I?" I shot back, feigning confidence. "What, you think Bigfoot's gonna get me?" The others laughed nervously, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. Tommy grinned. "Prove it. Go in, stay for an hour and come back. Easy." I knew I couldn't back down. Peer pressure was a powerful thing, and I didn't want to look like a coward. So I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped into the woods. The air changed the moment I crossed into the trees. It was cooler, heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The light from the campfire faded quickly, swallowed by the dense canopy above. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. At first, it wasn't so bad. The sounds of the night, crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, were almost soothing. I walked slowly, trying to convince myself this was no big deal. But after about 10 minutes, the atmosphere began to shift. The forest was too quiet now. The crickets had stopped, and even the wind seemed to avoid this place. I kept moving, telling myself I was imagining things. But then I saw it, a figure in the distance, standing perfectly still between the trees. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure was tall and unnervingly still. I raised my flashlight, the beam trembling as it landed on nothing. The figure was gone. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. I pressed on, my pace quickening. Every so often I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, the crack of a branch. But when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. About 20 minutes in, I decided I'd had enough. Forget the dare. Tommy could call me a coward all he wanted. I just wanted out of those woods. I turned to head back, but the path I'd been following was gone. Panic bubbled up in my chest as I spun in a circle, shining my flashlight in every direction. The trees looked the same, endless and oppressive. Okay, I whispered, trying to calm myself. "You came straight in, just go straight back." But no matter which direction I chose, I seemed to get deeper into the woods. The trees grew closer together, their twisted branches forming unnatural shapes. My flashlight began to flicker, the beam growing weaker with each passing moment. That's when I heard it, a voice, faint and childlike, calling my name. "Jake." I froze, my blood turning to ice. It wasn't possible. No one knew I was here except my friends, and they were back at the campfire. The voice came again, closer this time. "Jake, help me." Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I turned toward the sound. My flashlight flickered again, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak light to guide me. The voice led me deeper into the forest, until I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered and its roof sagging. The voice came from inside. "Jake, please." My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the cabin. The door creaked open as I approached, revealing nothing but blackness inside. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. But the voice came again, desperate and pleading. "Help me." I stepped inside. The air was suffocating, thick with the stench of rot and decay. My phone's light barely illuminated the room, revealing broken furniture and walls covered in deep, jagged scratches. The voice was silent now, but I could feel something watching me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Is someone there?" A low growl rumbled from the shadows, so deep it vibrated in my chest. My phone's light flickered, and for a split second I saw it. A figure crouched in the corner, its limbs impossibly long and its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Its mouth stretched into a grin far too wide for its face, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I bolted. I didn't care where I was going, I just ran, crashing through the trees, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The growl followed me, along with the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. It was fast, too fast. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, hear the wet, guttural noises it made as it chased me. Just when I thought it would catch me, I burst into another clearing. The campfire was in sight, its flames a beacon of safety. My friends jumped to their feet as I stumbled into the light, gasping for breath. "What the hell happened to you?" Tommy demanded, his bravado replaced by genuine concern. I couldn't speak. I just pointed toward the woods. They turned, but the trees were still, the darkness impenetrable. We didn't stick around to find out if it would follow. We packed up and left that night, driving back to town in tense silence. I don't know what I saw in those woods, and I don't want to know. I haven't been back since, and I never will. But sometimes late at night I hear that voice again, faint and far away. "Jake, help me."
Story number 7.
I never believed the stories about the Devil's Hollow until the night I found myself trapped there. It's a stretch of woods just outside of town, notorious for strange disappearances and oozes and whispered tales of something inhuman lurking among the trees. Most people avoided it, but curiosity, or maybe arrogance, got the better of me. It was late October, the air crisp and the leaves crackling underfoot. My friends, Emily and Ben, had dared me to spend the night in Devil's Hollow as part of some twisted Halloween challenge. "One night," Emily said with a smirk, "if you survive, drinks are on us for the rest of the month." Ben chimed in, "And if you don't, at least you'll be a legend." I rolled my eyes but agreed. I wasn't about to let them think I was scared. Besides, I figured the scariest thing I'd encounter would be a raccoon or maybe some weird noises in the dark. Armed with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and my phone, I set out just before sunset. The entrance to Devil's Hollow was marked by an old, rusted gate that hung off its hinges. The woods beyond seemed unnaturally dark, the trees gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. "See you in the morning," Emily called as I crossed into the hollow. Her voice had a mocking edge, but I caught the nervous glance she exchanged with Ben. It was the kind of look that lingered in my mind as I walked deeper into the forest. At first, it was uneventful. The woods were quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. I found a small clearing and set up my spot, spreading out the sleeping bag and gathering a few sticks to make a fire. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows, but I told myself it was just my imagination. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I thought it might be the wind. But then it came again, clearer this time, a single word. "Help." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound brave. "Is someone there?" No response. I scanned the woods with my flashlight, but the beam only illuminated more trees and shadows. Shaking it off as a trick of the wind, I sat back down, though the uneasy feeling in my gut didn't go away. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was hard to tell. Then I heard it again. "Help me." The voice was closer now, a hoarse whisper that sent chills down my spine. It didn't sound like a child or a woman. It was something in between, something unnatural. I stood up, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "If someone's out there, say something." "Are you hurt?" The woods answered with silence. I told myself to stay put. Wandering off into the forest in the middle of the night was the last thing I should do. But then I heard it again, louder this time, and it was accompanied by a sound that made my blood run cold, the soft crunch of footsteps. I spun around, the flashlight darting wildly. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, fear seeping into every word. The footsteps stopped. The clearing was deathly silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. And then I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Its face, I couldn't see its face. It was like the darkness clung to it, refusing to reveal what lay beneath. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my sleeping bag. "Stay back," I shouted, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, or at least I thought it was watching. Then, in one horrifying, jerky motion, it tilted its head to the side as if curious. That's when it started walking toward me. I didn't think. I just ran. The woods were a blur as I sprinted blindly, branches slashing at my face and arms. The flashlight slipped from my hand, plunging me into darkness, but I didn't dare stop. Behind me, I could hear it, a wet, shuffling noise like something dragging itself through the underbrush. It wasn't running, but it was keeping up. I didn't know where I was going. Every direction looked the same, an endless maze of trees and shadows. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop. The sound was getting closer, and with it came that voice again, rasping and broken. "Help me." I burst into another clearing and skidded to a halt. In the center stood an ancient well, its stones covered in moss and ivy. For a moment I thought I might be safe, but then I saw them. Handprints smeared across the stones, dark and glistening like fresh blood. The sound was louder now, right behind me. I turned, and there it was, emerging from the trees. Its movements were wrong, like a marionette with its strings tangled. As it stepped into the clearing, I finally saw its face, or what was left of it. The skin was stretched taut over jagged bones, and its mouth was a gaping hole filled with rows of needle-like teeth. Its eyes were hollow sockets, but they burned with an unnatural light. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice echoing into the night. It didn't answer. Instead, it raised one bony hand and pointed at the well. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No way." The creature let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through my very bones. It took another step forward, its skeletal hand still pointing. I had no choice. I ran to the well, peering over the edge. The darkness below seemed to stretch forever, but as I strained my eyes, I saw something moving down there, something alive. The creature was right behind me now. Its breath was hot and rancid against the back of my neck. Without thinking, I grabbed a rock from the edge of the well and threw it in. The sound of it hitting the water echoed eerily, and for a moment the movement below stopped. Then, from the depths of the well, a hand shot up, clawing at the edges. It was followed by another and another. Whatever was down there was climbing up. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted, not caring where I ended up, as long as it was away from that well and the thing chasing me. Somehow I found the old gate, its rusted frame glinting faintly in the moonlight. I stumbled through it and didn't stop running until I was back at my car. Emily and Ben were waiting there, their faces pale. "What happened?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. I couldn't answer. I just climbed into the car, locked the doors, and told them to drive. I don't know what I unleashed in those woods, but I haven't gone back to Devil's Hollow since. Sometimes late at night, I hear that voice again, faint and distant, calling to me.
Story number 8.
I don't know if I'll ever sleep soundly again. What happened to me last summer in the woods near Pine Lake feels more like a nightmare than something real. But it was real, too real. And I can still hear the whispers when it's too quiet at night. It started as a group camping trip, just a handful of us who thought it would be fun to spend a weekend unplugged and away from the city. There was me, my best friend Nate, his girlfriend Lily, and her younger brother Jordan. The four of us had grown up together, so the trip felt more like a reunion than anything. Pine Lake was our childhood spot, full of summer memories and carefree days, but this time it felt different. We arrived late in the afternoon and set up camp by the edge of the woods, just a short walk from the lake. The air was heavy, and the silence felt thicker than usual, broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves. Lily joked about it being prime horror movie territory, but we laughed it off. Jordan even brought a stack of scary stories to read around the fire later that night. After dinner, we gathered around the fire, the flames crackling and sending shadows dancing across the trees. Jordan opened the book and started reading a story about a lost camper who vanished without a trace. His voice was dramatic, and we all laughed, pretending to be scared, even though the story was unsettling. Then the forest answered. It was a faint sound at first, like a distant whistle coming from deep in the woods. Nate froze mid-laugh. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. We all listened, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. The whistle came again, clearer this time, and it was followed by something else, a faint, childlike giggle. "Okay, who's messing with us?" Nate asked, looking around. "Jordan, did you set up some kind of speaker or something?" Jordan held up his hands, wide-eyed. "Not me, I swear." Lily looked uneasy. "It's probably just another camper," she said, but her voice lacked confidence. "Out here?" I asked. "We're miles from the main trail. Who'd be wandering around at this hour?" We decided to ignore it, chalking it up to another camper or maybe just an animal. But the unease lingered, even as we moved on to ghost stories of our own. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. It wasn't until we were settling into our tents for the night that the real nightmare began. I woke up to a sound, a low, rhythmic tapping. For a moment, I thought it was rain hitting the tent, but when I listened closer, I realized it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the side of the tent, just inches from where I was lying. Tap, tap, tap. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I reached for my phone, using the screen's light to illuminate the tent. The tapping stopped. My heart was pounding as I unzipped the tent and peeked out, but the woods were empty, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I told myself it was just a branch or an animal and crawled back into my sleeping bag. But just as I was starting to drift off, the tapping returned, this time from the opposite side of the tent. I froze, too scared to move. And then, faintly, I heard it again, the giggle. It was close, impossibly close, as though whoever or whatever it was stood just outside. "Nate," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Are you awake?" There was no response from Nate's tent. Gathering every ounce of courage, I crawled out and hurried to his tent, unzipping it in a panic. "Nate, wake up," I hissed, shaking him. He stirred groggily. What's going on?" "I think someone's out here," I whispered. "I keep hearing." Before I could finish, the sound of footsteps crunching on leaves echoed from the woods. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Nate's eyes widened, and he grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the tree line. "Who's out there?" he called. "This isn't funny." The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. And then the whistle came again, this time so loud it felt like it was right behind us. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the camp was empty. By now, Lily and Jordan were awake, peeking out of their tent with confused, frightened expressions. "What's going on?" Lily asked. "Someone's messing with us," Nate said, his voice tight. "Stay together." We huddled near the fire, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark as we scanned the woods. The air felt electric, charged with a tension that made my skin crawl. Then we saw it, a figure standing just beyond the firelight, half hidden by the trees. "Hey," Nate shouted. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't move. It was tall, its silhouette thin and angular, almost wrong in its proportions. As we stared, the figure tilted its head, the motion unnaturally sharp like a puppet on strings. Lily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to leave," she whispered. Nate took a step forward, his flashlight fixed on the figure. "I'm warning you," he said, his voice wavering. "Stay back." The figure didn't listen. Instead, it took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. And that's when we saw its face, or what should have been its face. There were no features, just a smooth, pale surface that seemed to absorb the light. Jordan let out a strangled scream, and the figure moved faster, almost gliding toward us. We bolted, abandoning the fire and the tents as we ran toward the lake. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and clawing like they were alive. The whistle followed us, rising and falling in a haunting melody. And then came the giggles, high-pitched and echoing, as though there were dozens of voices all around us. We didn't stop until we reached the lake, the water shimmering under the pale moonlight. Gasping for breath, we turned, expecting to see the figure right behind us. But the woods were empty, eerily still. "What was that?" Lily sobbed, clutching Jordan. "I don't know," Nate said, his voice shaking. "But we're not staying to find out." We made it back to the car just as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. The campsite was a blur as we sped away, none of us daring to look back. When we returned to town, we tried to tell people what had happened, but no one believed us. "You must have scared yourselves," they said, laughing it off as a Halloween prank gone wrong. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind whistles just right, I swear I can hear it again. That faint, childlike giggle that reminds me the woods of Pine Lake will never truly let us go.
Story number 9.
There's something about the woods at night that makes your heart race, even if nothing's wrong. The way the trees seem to shift, the way every sound feels louder than it should. You start to think that maybe you're not as alone as you thought. That's exactly what happened to me last year. And I'm still not sure how I made it out alive. It was supposed to be a solo camping trip. I'd been going through some stuff, a bad breakup, work stress, and I just needed to get away. I chose Bear Ridge, a remote spot about an hour's hike from the nearest parking area. It wasn't the first time I'd camped alone, and I loved the idea of being completely disconnected for a few days. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun dipping low, but still casting enough light to navigate the trail. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled my lungs as I trudged through the underbrush. When I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the view was breathtaking. The dense forest opened up to a small meadow, and beyond it, a rocky outcrop overlooked the valley below. As I pitched my tent and gathered wood for the fire, I felt at peace for the first time in weeks. By the time night fell, I was sitting by the fire with a cup of instant coffee, staring at the stars. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the distant calls of owls. It was perfect. Until it wasn't. The first strange thing happened as I was getting ready to crawl into my tent. I was putting out the fire when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A flash of movement at the edge of the meadow. I turned, my headlamp cutting through the dark, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer or maybe a fox. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. Once inside the tent, I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and tried to relax. The forest was alive with its usual sounds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of a cricket. I focused on those noises, letting them lull me to sleep. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from the trees, maybe a branch swaying in the wind. But as I lay there, straining to listen, I realized it was coming from outside the tent, specifically from right by my head. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer. Just the tapping, slow and deliberate. I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the fabric of the tent as I shone it toward the sound. The tapping stopped. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, but the meadow was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. The fire was nothing but smoldering embers. I sat there for a while, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was some animal curiosity and zipped the tent back up. The tapping didn't return, but something else did. I woke up a few hours later to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, soft and melodic, singing some kind of lullaby. The words were faint, carried on the wind, but the tune was unmistakably human. Sleep, little one, in the cradle of trees. It was coming from the woods. I sat up, my entire body shaking. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere, singing in the dead of night? I grabbed my flashlight again, unzipping the tent slowly and stepping out into the cold. The fire was completely out now, the meadow shrouded in darkness. The singing stopped the moment I emerged. "Hello?" I called, louder this time. "Is someone there?" Silence. I shone the flashlight toward the trees, the beam bouncing off trunks and branches, but revealing nothing unusual. Just as I was about to head back into the tent, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the far edge of the meadow, just barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with long arms that hung unnaturally low. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, as though it were studying me. My flashlight flickered as I tried to focus on it, and in that moment, it moved. Not walking, but gliding silently across the grass, its movements too smooth to be natural. I stumbled back into the tent, zipping it up and grabbing my hunting knife. My hands were slick with sweat as I held it in front of me, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. The figure didn't follow, but then I heard something worse. The lullaby started again, this time just outside the tent. "Sleep, little one, where the shadows creep." The voice was closer now, impossibly close, and it wasn't alone. There were others, multiple voices, harmonizing in eerie, dissonant tones. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it was everywhere, surrounding me. I don't know how long I stayed in the tent, shaking and praying for it to stop. Eventually, the singing faded, replaced by the familiar sounds of the forest. I waited until the first light of dawn before unzipping the tent and stepping outside. The meadow was empty, the woods eerily still, but there was something on the ground just a few feet from my tent, a small pile of rocks, stacked neatly, with a single black feather on top. I didn't bother packing up my gear. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and bolted back to the trail, not stopping until I reached my car. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched, the weight of unseen eyes following me through the trees. When I got home, I looked up the history of Bear Ridge, desperate for some explanation. What I found still haunts me. The area was once home to a small settlement, abandoned in the 1800s after a string of unexplained disappearances. The locals believed the woods were cursed, inhabited by spirits who lured people away with song. I don't know if I believe in curses or spirits, but I know what I heard, what I saw, and I'm never going back to the woods again.
Story number 10.
It started as a group camping trip, a chance to escape the city and reconnect with old friends. 6 of us, me, Jamie, Eric, Sarah, Lucy, and David, drove out to Pine Hollow, a remote spot in the Appalachian woods known for its unmarked trails and untouched beauty. It was supposed to be an adventure. Instead, it became a nightmare I'll never forget. The drive was uneventful, filled with laughter and the kind of jokes you only share with people you've known for years. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp near a small clearing by the lake. The forest was alive with the hum of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt peaceful, serene. That first night, we built a fire and told ghost stories, each one trying to outdo the others. Jamie told a story about a woman in white who haunted the woods, while David recounted a local legend about a hunter who disappeared and was later found impaled on his own arrows. The stories were fun, chilling enough to send shivers down our spines, but not enough to keep us from sleeping. Then Lucy brought up the story of the hollow ones. Supposedly, she began, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight, "There's something in these woods. Not animals, not people. They're hollow. They mimic voices, lure people deeper into the forest. And when they get you alone, they take something from you. Your face, your voice, your soul." Sarah groaned. "Oh, come on, Lucy. That's just some campfire nonsense." Lucy shrugged, a sly grin on her face. "Maybe, but they say you'll know they're near if you hear someone calling your name, even if it's a voice you trust." We laughed it off, but the story stuck with me, replaying in my mind as I lay in my sleeping bag later that night. I told myself it was just a story, a silly tale meant to spook us. But the woods felt different after that, less welcoming. The next day, we spent most of the afternoon hiking. The trails were faint, barely more than animal paths, and the deeper we went, the more isolated we felt. By late afternoon, we decided to head back, our legs aching and our water bottles nearly empty. That's when we heard it. Eric, a voice called, faint and distant. Eric froze, his brow furrowing. Did someone just call me? We all stopped, listening. The forest was silent except for the occasional chirp of a bird. Eric, the voice came again, louder this time. It sounded like Sarah, but Sarah was right there with us, her face pale and confused. I didn't say anything, she whispered. Jamie laughed nervously. It's probably an echo or something. An echo of what? David asked, his voice tight. We decided to keep moving, quickening our pace, but the voice kept calling, getting closer, more insistent. Eric! Over here! Whoever's messing with us, cut it out! Eric shouted, spinning around, but there was no one behind us, no sign of anyone in the dense undergrowth. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. Eric was visibly shaken, and honestly, so were the rest of us. We built another fire, trying to shake off the unease, but the air felt heavy, like the forest itself was pressing in on us. That night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. Someone whispering my name. Mark. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it was enough to jolt me awake. I sat up, my heart pounding. The others were all asleep, their breathing slow and steady. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the chilly night air. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim, flickering light across the clearing. Hello, I called out, my voice shaking. Who's there? No answer, just the whisper, closer this time. Mark, come here. It sounded like Lucy, but when I glanced at her tent, the zipper was still closed. My stomach churned as I took a step back, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It looked like Lucy, but something was off. Her posture was too rigid, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her face was shadowed, but I could see her eyes glinting in the faint light. Lucy? I whispered. She didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head in a jerky, unnatural motion, as if trying to understand me. Then she stepped forward, her movements stiff and deliberate. I bolted back into my tent, zipping it up and waking Jamie. Someone's out there, I hissed. What are you talking about? Jamie mumbled, groggy and annoyed. Before I could explain, we heard it. Voices outside the tent, overlapping and distorted, calling all of our names. Jamie, Sarah, Eric, Mark. The others woke up, panic spreading through the group as the voices grew louder, circling the campsite. David grabbed the hatchet we'd used to chop firewood, while Sarah clutched a flashlight, her hands trembling. What the hell is going on? Eric whispered. We stayed huddled together until dawn, too scared to leave the tents. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, the voices stopped. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels wrong. We packed up and left as quickly as we could, barely speaking as we hiked back to the car. But the nightmare wasn't over. As we loaded our gear into the trunk, I noticed something on the windshield, a single black handprint, smudged and streaky, as if someone had pressed their hand against the glass and dragged it downward. None of us could explain what happened that night. We don't talk about it, not really. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that voice calling my name, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd followed it.